Please. Should we have order for Deputy Daly?
To condemn the genocide perpetuated by the sectarian apartheid Israeli state against innocent Palestinians, and I support the BDS campaign against that nation. But I want to return to the issue of the cervical smear cancer, because the way in which this issue is being handled is an absolute disservice to the women at the heart of it, and it's actually perpetuating a situation where we will not change things if we don't cop on. That there are people who are surprised about a memo which said leave off a decision on telling people until we sort out the legality. That people are surprised about that, well, that shocks me, because where have those people been? Do they not know that there are people who've seen their babies die or be gravely injured in our hospitals and aren't given answers? Do they not know that there are men who've held their wives' hand as they're robbed of their lives as a result of clinical negligence in our hospitals, and they can't get answers? Have people in here forgotten Portlaoise, Portiuncula? 10 years, 3.5 years for the report to be published, and today 5 bereaved families are still before the courts. Do people not know that this is what happens in our health service? That maybe 5, maybe 10 years after you suffer a devastating loss, you might settle with the HSE, you might get an apology, you might get a few answers, but you mightn't. That's our health service. And you know, we might need a commission to find out how the latest scandal happened, but we don't need a commission to tell us why. It's happening because of the actions of everybody in this House, and I'm frankly sick of it. I couldn't care less if you were the Health Minister, if Micheál Martin was the Health Minister, because it goes on. Governments are too busy staying in power to actually govern. Opposition are too busy scoring cheap political points to actually hold governments to account, and the media are too bloody lazy to analyse what goes on in here. So the civil service rule, unelected and unaccounted. Now, we don't need a new oversight governance body here. There are a suite of measures which have long been flagged that could alter and transform the situation now. It's in your programme for government. Mandatory open disclosure, which ye balked from and which they were nobbled on and voted against us on last year. Mandatory inquests into maternal deaths. Last year, Francis Fitzgerald promised us it would be delivered before the summer. You told me in February it would be published. It's still not published yet. Pre-action protocols, we passed them, they haven't been enacted. A huge amount of what's gone on in our health service is because of litigation in the backdrop. It's a requirement to notify the State's Claims Agency 48 hours after a serious adverse incident, but not to tell the patients. Clinical claims against this state have an estimated liability of $1.98 billion, an increase of $1 billion in 5 years. Families being dragged through the courts. If a family hasn't got the money, it can't do it. They have to pay for their own experts' reports. We know one family with cerebral palsy where 46 expert reports were commissioned 6 years before they got damages.
Thank you,
and yet, my last point, of the 244 cases settled in 2016, only 5 went to court. Taoiseach, there are measures in your programme for government which, if you enacted them, would transform the situation. Would you look at those, including a no-fault compensation system to deal with this issue for once and for all, and take the lawyers out of the hospitals?
Taoiseach.
I think Deputy Daly makes some very valid points. I think there has been too much political point scoring around this issue and a degree of political opportunism as well. And if we genuinely want to put women and patients in general first, we should look for solutions, ask what we can actually do to improve this situation, which, as you say, has gone on for decades. A suite of measures are required. I would argue that we're making good progress in implementing those suite of measures. This government involving Fine Gael, Independent Alliance and Independence has brought about very significant legal reforms in the past 2 years. We have the Mediation Act, for example, and we have seen cases in recent weeks settled by mediation to the satisfaction of both sides. We've brought in the legislation for periodic payment orders to move away from massive settlements of 10 or 13 million so that somebody's needs can be assessed along the way and they can be given additional funding along the way, or additional compensation along the way if they require it. We have the Legal Services Regulatory Act, which puts in law the pre-action protocols. And yes, I know that hasn't been commenced yet, but we have done the legislation. We will commence it as soon as possible. And yes, we do have the Civil Liability Act, which provides for voluntary open disclosure. And that is very important. I know some people have dismissed it, but it is important because it removes the excuses. It tries to create a culture of truth rather than a culture of secrecy, where doctors, nurses, midwives and managers are not afraid that by apologising that will be used against them in a court, that by admitting a mistake that will be used against them as an admission of liability. And that's why we brought in the Civil Liability Act. That's why we passed it through this House, and that's why it will be commenced by June once we have the guidelines in place. In addition to that, the Patient Safety Office has been established within the Department of Health, and that's a very important measure forward as well. And yes, you are right, there are two major outstanding issues in the programme for government, which is a 5-year programme for government, by the way. We're only entering year 3. There are two outstanding issues in the programme for government which we now need to get done. First is the mandatory reporting of serious reportable incidents. We're going to do that. The Patient Safety Bill has already had its heads go through the Cabinet. We're going to get that done in the next couple of months. And also, I have initiated the establishment of a working group to look at alternative means of settling medical negligence cases, including the no-fault system. It operates in New Zealand, operates in some other countries. There are pluses and minuses, and bear in mind that some people do want to ascribe fault. They do actually want to find out who is to blame. But where no fault exists, it can work quite well and should be considered as an option. So we're going to establish that working group, which is committed to in the programme for government, under an independent chair involving my department, the AG's office, the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and also the Department of Public Expenditure.
Taoiseach, I genuinely do not blame you for anything that has happened before now, but I am going to blame you for what happens next. On the day in which you announced here that the Attorney-General was being instructed to cease litigation in the cervical cancer cases, there was a family that appeared before the High Court in Kilkenny. It was the 9th time they went before the courts for discovery in a case of pandemics. Now, we know that in September 2009, before any child was given pandemics, the CMO of the HSE received a letter from the Chief Executive of the Irish Medicines Board expressing their concerns about the impact of the absence of data on the product information and the dangers for the dosage in children and pregnant women. And yet, 1 month later, in October 2009, the HSE issued a glowing report which stated that pandemics was safe as the seasonal flu vaccine, in direct contradiction to the letter they got from the Irish Medicines Board the day before. And there are dozens of families before the courts waiting for 8 years to get answers. I'm asking you, if you're serious here about a change in culture, the first step has to be a moratorium on all of those cases and all of the devastation and the years of litigation and money that families are being put through. Call a halt to it first and then look at engagement on a proper redress scheme in advance of a proper no-fault compensation scheme.
Taoiseach.
I don't know anything about the details of that specific case, so it would be improper for me to comment on it. But it relates obviously to a vaccine rather than the issue of cervical cancer screening. But I appreciate it's part of the bigger issue of how we deal with medical harm and medical negligence. The last time I studied that topic and got a briefing on it, my understanding was that there wasn't sufficient epidemiological evidence or scientific evidence to make a long word sensible to show that that vaccine caused the harms that were claimed. But I'll take a look at that again because it's not something I've had an engagement on in at least 2 years.
Matthew McGrath.
Taoiseach.